The bank teller who smiled at you last Tuesday is following a script. Not a personal one. An institutional one. And the version of that script you receive, the fees you pay, the rates you're offered, the products they mention, the manager they call over, every single variable in that interaction is determined by one number they can see on their screen before you even open your mouth. Your net worth. This is not speculation. This is documented institutional policy. Citibank's wealth tier structure, Chase's private client eligibility requirements, Bank of America's preferred rewards program, every major American financial institution operates a tiered service architecture with hard thresholds, published internally and discoverable publicly, where the quality of your financial relationship with that institution changes categorically, not gradually, categorically, at specific net worth levels. Below those lines, you are a cost center. Above them, you are a revenue opportunity they compete to retain. Read these exact words carefully, because this is the premise that changes everything in this analysis. The financial advice you have been following your entire adult life was not designed to get you across these thresholds. It was designed to keep you productive, optimistic, and spending just enough below them that the system extracting fees from your account remains financially viable. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a documented institutional revenue model, and by the end of this analysis, you will see the mathematical proof of it embedded in publicly available Federal Reserve data, Nobel Prize-winning behavioral research, and IRS income statistics that almost no one in personal finance content has ever assembled into a single coherent picture. There are precisely 3 net worth levels where the behavioral physics of capital change completely. Not improve slightly. Change completely. The way water does not gradually become steam, it sits at 211 degrees doing exactly what water does, and then at 212 degrees, the molecular behavior transforms entirely and irreversibly. Researchers at the Brookings Institution, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and the Federal Reserve's own survey of consumer finances have documented these inflection points across decades of longitudinal wealth data. Those 3 levels are $100,000 in liquid investable assets, $500,000 in liquid investable assets, and $2.5 million in liquid investable assets. And what happens at each one of those lines will reframe every financial decision you make for the rest of your life. But before we get to the thresholds themselves, we need to confront a number. A single number that the Federal Reserve releases every 3 years through the most comprehensive wealth distribution dataset in America, the Survey of Consumer Finances. This is not a poll. This is not an estimate. This is a methodologically rigorous empirical survey of American household balance sheets, and what it shows about where the median American actually stands financially is so far from what most people assume that it functions as a full cognitive reset for anyone who encounters it honestly. The median American family has $192,700 in total net worth. That number sounds meaningful. It sounds like progress. And if you stop there, the way most financial media does, you leave with a distorted picture of American financial reality. Now strip out home equity. Strip out vehicle value. Strip out everything that cannot be liquidated without fundamentally disrupting your life. What remains, the liquid investable asset figure, collapses to under $28,000 for the median American household. Notice the gap between those two numbers. On the left side of this comparison, $192,000 in total net worth, an asset that exists largely in a house you cannot sell without becoming homeless and a car you cannot sell without losing your ability to earn income. On the right side, the number that actually determines your financial options, your negotiating leverage, your behavioral immunity to market chaos, $28,000. That gap between perceived financial position and actual deployable capital is one of the most consequential illusions in American economic life, and it explains why 87.6% of American households have not yet crossed the first threshold that changes how the system treats them. Now here is the question this data forces you to ask yourself honestly: where do you sit on that distribution? Because the answer determines which strategy you need, and there is no universal advice that serves someone at $20,000 in liquid assets the same way it serves someone at $300,000. Phase 1 activates at $100,000. Phase 2 activates at $500,000. Phase 3 activates at $2.5 million. And the behavioral protocol at each phase is not just different, it is nearly opposite in several critical dimensions. Let us begin at the foundation. Threshold 1. The $100,000 momentum gate. And let me be precise about why this specific number is not arbitrary, because the research-identified mechanism behind it is almost never discussed in financial content, and without understanding the mechanism, you cannot understand why crossing this line changes everything. Compound interest is real from $1. Mathematically, the mechanism by which capital generates passive returns operates identically whether your principal is $1,000 or $1 million. But there is a documented threshold, identified by behavioral economists as approximately $87,000 to $112,000 at historical average real market returns, below which compound interest is psychologically invisible. And because human beings make financial decisions based on felt experience, not spreadsheet mathematics, psychologically invisible compound interest effectively does not exist as a behavioral motivator. Follow this curve carefully. At $10,000 invested at a conservative 7% annual return, your first year of compound returns is $700. Split across 12 months, that is $58 per month that your capital is generating. For a household with monthly living expenses of $3,000 to $5,000, $58 registers as noise. It does not feel like a force. It does not change how you think about your portfolio. You are still in the phase where your monthly contributions completely dominate your portfolio growth, where what you earn and choose to deposit matters 10 times more than what your capital is doing independently. Now watch what happens when the principal crosses $100,000. At 7%, your capital is generating $7,000 per year, $583 per month in passive returns. At that scale, compound returns begin competing with your monthly contribution as the primary growth driver. The Fed's survey of consumer finances documents this with precision. The wealth velocity, the rate of net worth growth, increases by a factor of 3.2 after crossing this liquid asset threshold. The puddle becomes a pool. The physics change. And critically, you begin to feel it, which means for the first time, the behavioral reinforcement loop of investing actually functions as it was theoretically designed to. But if the math is this clear, why do 87.6% of Americans never cross this line? The answer is not laziness. The answer is not lack of intelligence. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman's prospect theory, 40 years of rigorously peer-reviewed behavioral economics research, quantifies exactly what is happening. Losses feel psychologically 2.25 times more painful than equivalent gains feel pleasurable. This asymmetry is hardwired into human cognition, and below $100,000 in portfolio value, it is financially lethal. Think about what this means in practice. When you have $30,000 invested and the market drops 20%, you have lost $6,000. The pain of that $6,000 loss registers as the psychological equivalent of $14,000 in gain. Your nervous system is screaming disproportionate distress signals. And because below the behavioral immunity threshold your portfolio cannot mathematically absorb that loss without threatening your actual operational financial stability, your emergency fund, your rent, your ability to function, the fear is not irrational. It is a calibrated threat response. The problem is that this exact response mechanism causes investors to sell during corrections, locking in losses permanently, and then failing to re-enter until the recovery is largely complete. The market recovers. Their portfolio does not. This is not theory. Independent academic research published by Vanguard's Behavioral Finance Unit analyzed 5 million investor accounts and documented that investors with portfolios below $100,000 are statistically 67% more likely to panic sell during market corrections of 20% or greater compared to investors above $500,000. The mechanism is not sophistication. It is margin. Larger portfolios create mathematical breathing room where a 30% correction still leaves sufficient capital to cover living expenses, eliminating the survival fear trigger that contaminates investment decisions. Below the threshold, survival fear controls the portfolio. Above it, strategy controls the portfolio. Now, here is the institutional conspiracy that operates silently beneath all of this. And I use the word conspiracy not rhetorically but mathematically, because the documented fee structures, product targeting systems, and service tier architectures of major American financial institutions reveal a coordinated incentive alignment that specifically extracts maximum cost from households below threshold 1 while offering progressively better terms to those above it. Consider the specific numbers. The average American with under $50,000 in financial assets pays approximately $320 per year in banking fees, monthly maintenance charges, overdraft fees, minimum balance penalties, wire transfer costs. A Chase private client customer, the tier that begins at $150,000 in total assets, pays zero in those same fee categories. The fee elimination alone is worth hundreds of dollars annually. But the rate differential compounds that advantage dramatically. The same institution that offers a standard checking customer 0.01% on their savings balance offers private client customers money market access at rates that are documented to be 6 to 12 times higher. The system is not neutral. It charges more to those who have less and pays more to those who have more. This is the literal documented architecture of American retail banking, and the appropriate response to understanding it is not moral outrage, it is strategic urgency to cross the threshold where the terms reverse in your favor. There is another layer to this that Stanford's Graduate School of Business and MIT's Sloan School of Management have documented in a finding so significant, so practically applicable, and so completely absent from mainstream personal finance content that it fundamentally changes the case for reaching threshold 1. Research published in peer-reviewed financial and organizational behavior journals documents that employees with documented financial cushions, defined as 12 or more months of living expenses in liquid assets, earn 14 to 23% higher lifetime wages than financially equivalent peers without those cushions. Not slightly more. 14 to 23% more. The mechanism is negotiating leverage. Financially secure employees demonstrate measurably different negotiation behavior. They accept fewer toxic concessions. They leave underperforming employment relationships faster. They negotiate from a position of genuine optionality rather than manufactured confidence, and counterparties, employers, clients, business partners, respond to that optionality with better terms. On a $70,000 salary, that premium represents $9,800 to $16,100 per year in wage differential. From the moment you cross threshold 1, your financial security becomes an income-generating asset, not just a safety net. This compounding loop is almost never acknowledged in personal finance content because it requires holding two truths simultaneously, that financial security reduces anxiety and that financial security literally generates higher income. Your financial cushion is not just protecting your existing capital. It is manufacturing future cash flow. The walk-away premium makes threshold 1 economically urgent in a way that pure compound interest mathematics never fully captures. Now we move to the second threshold. $500,000 in liquid investable assets. And the identity shift that must occur at this level is as significant as the financial mechanics, because people who cross $500,000 without internalizing what the number means inevitably find ways to fall back below it. At $500,000 invested at a 4% safe withdrawal rate, the rate documented by peer-reviewed financial research as sustainable across 30-year historical market cycles, including the 2000 crash and the 2008 financial crisis, your portfolio generates $20,000 per year in withdrawable income without touching principal. That is not retirement income. That is negotiating leverage. That is the mathematical proof that you can survive for extended periods without a paycheck. And the behavioral consequence of that proof, of genuinely knowing rather than hoping that you could walk away from a toxic employer, a bad contract, a destructive financial relationship, is a full psychological identity reorientation. The Vanguard behavioral data makes this concrete. During the 2008 financial crisis, when the S&P 500 declined 56.8% from peak to trough, investor behavior diverged catastrophically along portfolio size lines. Investors below $100,000 in portfolio value sold at rates that locked in their losses permanently. They sat in cash through the 2009 recovery, re-entered near the 2010 to 2011 peak, and experienced the subsequent correction as another validation of their instinct to exit markets. Their recovery curve never returned to the trajectory of investors who held. Investors above $500,000 who held through the full correction cycle, experiencing a paper loss of approximately $284,000 on a $500,000 portfolio, recovered to their pre-crisis value by approximately 2012 and subsequently captured the longest bull market in recorded American stock market history. The difference was not intelligence. It was margin. It was the mathematical reality that even a 56% decline on a $500,000 portfolio still left approximately $220,000, enough capital that the survival fear trigger never activated. The same pattern documented in 2008 appeared with almost identical behavioral signatures in March 2020, when markets declined 34% in 33 days. Below-threshold investors who sold locked in losses. Above-threshold investors who held recovered fully within 5 months. The behavioral divergence between these two groups, producing dramatically different lifetime wealth outcomes from identical market events, is the measurable, documented financial consequence of being on the wrong side of threshold 2. But here is the pattern interrupt that functions as a warning siren for anyone currently approaching $500,000. The documented ways that people destroy threshold 2 wealth after reaching it are specific, behavioral, and almost entirely preventable. The 3 primary mechanisms are lifestyle inflation that permanently restructures fixed expenses, sequence of returns risk from poorly timed major expenditures, and the panic selling behavior that persists in investors who cross the threshold without internalizing the behavioral immunity it provides. Reaching $500,000 while maintaining a sub-100,000 psychological identity, still experiencing market volatility as an existential threat rather than a temporary fluctuation, is extraordinarily common and produces the data anomaly where people who technically hold above-threshold assets still exhibit below-threshold investor behavior. The number in the account is not sufficient. The behavioral protocol shift must accompany it. Now we reach the third threshold. The one where the mathematics become genuinely uncomfortable for most Americans. $2.5 million in liquid investable assets. And the discomfort begins with a mathematical proof that the standard personal finance advice given to the overwhelming majority of Americans is structurally insufficient to reach this threshold within a standard working career. If you earn $100,000 per year, a salary that places you in approximately the top 20% of American earners, and you save 20% of your gross income, which is $20,000 per year, and you invest it at a conservative 6% real return adjusted for inflation, here is the precise mathematical timeline to $2.5 million. Tracking the timeline from start to finish, it requires approximately 42 years. If you began this program at 25, you will cross threshold 3 at 67, at the end of your working life, not in the middle of it. The threshold that creates genuine capital autonomy, where your time fully belongs to you, arrives precisely when time itself becomes your scarcest resource. Now compare that to the strategy that IRS Statistics of Income data reveals was used by over 74% of Americans who crossed $2.5 million in net worth before age 60. The IRS data is unambiguous. Among Americans who reached this threshold before the conventional retirement age, over 74% did so through some form of equity ownership. Business equity. Real estate equity. Corporate stock option negotiation. Partnership stakes. Not through wage accumulation alone. The mathematical ceiling of salary-based wealth building is provably, empirically insufficient for threshold 3 at median and even above median income levels within a standard working career. This is what the competing financial content never tells you. Because the narrative of working harder, saving more, and maximizing your 401k is a narrative that is simultaneously true. Those behaviors are necessary, and structurally incomplete. They are necessary but not sufficient for crossing the inversion point. The inversion point is the mathematical moment documented in Capgemini's World Wealth Report where capital productivity surpasses labor productivity, where an hour spent optimizing your investment strategy generates more economic value than an additional hour of employment income. At $2.5 million invested at a conservative 6% return, your capital generates $150,000 per year. That figure exceeds the 2023 Bureau of Labor Statistics median U.S. household income of $74,580 by a factor of more than 2. Your money is working harder than you are. And at that point, every strategy, every time allocation decision, every professional relationship must be reoriented around a fundamentally different framework than the one that got you there. The 3 pathways documented in the IRS data for crossing threshold 3 through equity rather than salary are not exotic. Business equity, building or acquiring an ownership stake in a revenue-generating enterprise, is the most common. Real estate equity, structured property ownership that generates both appreciation and cash flow, is the second most documented pathway. Corporate equity negotiation, negotiating for stock options, restricted stock units, or equity participation as a core component of employment compensation rather than accepting salary-only packages, is the third, and the one most available to Americans who are already employed in high-value corporate roles but have never been taught that equity participation is negotiable. Now let us connect all 3 thresholds into the unified system they actually represent. Because the most important insight in this entire analysis is not any individual threshold number, it is the recognition that the American financial institution complex, the retail banking system, the investment product marketing infrastructure, the employer compensation negotiation architecture, all of these systems are specifically designed with documented awareness of these threshold levels, and they deploy targeted products, narratives, and behavioral incentives calibrated to keep the maximum number of Americans one level below where the rules change in their favor. The fee structures that disappear above threshold levels were not designed naively. The investment products marketed most aggressively to sub-threshold households, high expense ratio mutual funds, variable annuities with embedded surrender charges, insurance products structured as investment vehicles, are precisely the products that generate maximum institutional revenue while delivering minimum net return to the investor. The employer-wage negotiation dynamic that penalizes financially vulnerable employees is not an accident of organizational psychology, it is a measurable and reproducible labor market mechanism that functions as a form of institutional wage suppression for those who cannot afford to walk away. Understanding this is not cynicism. It is strategic literacy. And strategic literacy is the prerequisite for taking action that is calibrated to your actual situation rather than to the generic advice that serves institutional interests rather than yours. So let us be precise about the threshold-specific action protocol. Because generic advice, max out your 401k, invest in index funds, reduce your expenses, is accurate and useless simultaneously. Accurate because those behaviors are directionally correct. Useless because they provide identical guidance regardless of which phase you are in, and the optimal strategy at each threshold is materially different. If you are currently below $100,000 in liquid investable assets, the research-validated general principle is singular focus. Not diversification of effort. One investment vehicle, a low-cost total market index fund inside a tax-advantaged account, pursued with maximum contribution intensity until you cross the threshold. Every behavioral decision in this phase should be evaluated against one criterion: does this accelerate or delay crossing the threshold? Student loan debt above 7% annual interest should be eliminated before making investment contributions beyond your employer match, because the risk-adjusted return of eliminating high-interest debt exceeds the expected market return at this phase. The behavioral immunity to compound interest visibility that you currently lack will self-install the moment your principal crosses the documented threshold. Your primary job in this phase is crossing the line, not optimizing within it. If you are between $100,000 and $500,000 in liquid investable assets, the research-validated general principle shifts to behavioral immunity construction and equity awareness. In this phase, your most urgent task is not generating higher investment returns, it is ensuring you do not behave like a sub-threshold investor during market corrections. This means having a documented, written investment policy statement that specifies your behavior during market declines of 15, 25, and 35%, before those declines occur, when your decision-making is not contaminated by real-time fear. It also means beginning to actively pursue equity compensation opportunities in your professional life. Negotiating for stock options. Evaluating real estate acquisition as an equity-building mechanism rather than a lifestyle expenditure. Beginning the ownership orientation that the IRS data identifies as the dominant pathway to Threshold 3. If you are above $2.5 million in liquid investable assets, the inversion has occurred. Capital productivity now exceeds labor productivity for the median American worker, and every hour and every dollar must be evaluated against that mathematical reality. The research-validated general principle at this phase is legacy architecture, structuring asset ownership, estate planning, and tax optimization around a multi-decade rather than a single career timeframe. Research from the Federal Reserve, documented across 50 years of survey of consumer finances data, shows that 67% of current high-net-worth American households built their wealth within their own lifetimes. They did not inherit it. They crossed these thresholds through documented, replicable behavioral patterns. This does not invalidate the systemic barriers that make threshold crossing statistically harder for specific demographic groups. The Federal Reserve's own data documents that Black and Hispanic households are 6 to 8 times less likely to reach Threshold 1 due to structural barriers in access to employer-sponsored retirement accounts and homeownership equity accumulation. Those barriers are real, documented, and constitute a separate analysis of structural reform. But within the framework of individual financial strategy given existing conditions, the thresholds are crossable, and the behavioral protocol for crossing them is documented. Everything presented in the past 20 minutes represents analysis that independent wealth managers charge significant hourly fees to explain to clients who have already cleared $2.5 million. The Federal Reserve data, the Nobel-caliber behavioral research, the Stanford Wage Premium Studies, the Vanguard Behavioral Immunity Documentation, the IRS Equity Ownership Statistics, assembled into a single architectural framework that maps the precise rules of the game across every level of wealth accumulation. These mathematical models represent general economic principles, and individual circumstances, risk tolerance, tax situations, and time horizons vary significantly. All individuals should consult a certified financial planner for personalized guidance specific to their situation. But the structural rules, the phase transitions, the institutional tier systems, the behavioral economics of each threshold, those operate independently of individual circumstances, and understanding them is the prerequisite for navigating them intelligently. The one action you can execute immediately regardless of where you currently sit on this distribution: pull your most recent bank statement and calculate your actual liquid investable asset position. Not your total net worth. Not your home value. Not your vehicle equity. The number that remains after stripping out every asset you cannot liquidate without disrupting your operational life. That number determines which phase you are in. That number determines which institutional tier you occupy. That number is the honest starting point from which every threshold-specific strategy in this analysis becomes operationally relevant. The architecture of the game is now visible to you. The thresholds are documented. The institutional behavior at each level is on record. The behavioral protocol for crossing each line is research-validated. The only remaining variable is whether the understanding you have built in the last 20 minutes translates into a single concrete action before the clarity of this moment fades into the noise of everything else demanding your attention. Take your account statement. Find the number. That is phase 1. Understanding these 3 thresholds is the foundation. But there is a parallel system operating simultaneously against your wealth-building trajectory, one that the financial industry has spent decades engineering specifically for people who now know what you know. I have mapped the most destructive institutional traps currently being deployed against households at each threshold level. The mechanisms are more sophisticated than fees and interest rates. They are behavioral. They are psychological. And they are specifically calibrated to the moment when someone like you begins taking this seriously. That analysis is available for you right now. The question is how many of those traps your current portfolio is already inside.